honor Don, and if you'll allow me, I think it is fitting that we look back and remember what kind of country and world in which Don was born, grew up, and began his career, so that we can better appreciate and understand Don as a man, what he has seen and lived through, and the part he has played in making us and all of this world really a better place, both in the big picture and the smaller picture. To begin, I'd like us to reflect back on what life in America was like when Don was born. Don is part of the consideration considered to be America's greatest generation. He was born on a Saturday, May 28, 1921, in Wisconsin. The 1920s was a profound time of significant social and political change, and the decade is commonly referred to as the Roaring Twenties. World War I had just ended 3 years before Don was born, and Americans were eager to return to a state of normalcy. But instead of returning to a state of normalcy, the decade Don was born into turned out to be an age of dramatic social and political change. The nation's total wealth more than doubled between the period when Don was born and his 10th birthday. And this economic growth swept many Americans for the first time into a consumer society. And we had extra money to spend on consumer goods. And in particular, we bought radios. The first commercial radio station started a year before Don was born. But by the time Don was 10 years old, there were hundreds of stations, and millions of Americans were turning into their radios every evening. When Don was born, there were very few cars on the road. But by the time Don was 10, there was one automobile on the road for every 5 Americans. Wow. Meanwhile, as the economy of automobiles was born, the countryside changed. Everything spread out. Businesses like gas service stations and motels sprang up all over the country to meet drivers' needs. While some freedoms were expanded in the U.S. During Don's early years, others were curtailed. For example, the U.S. Constitution was changed, prohibition, banning the sale of liquor. And soon thereafter, every bar and saloon in the United States was officially shut down. This drove the liquor trade underground to be controlled by bootleggers and racketeers and mobsters and organized crime figures such as Chicago gangster Al Capone. Hopefully, Don and his family didn't have a run-in with Al Capone because they were living in Chicago at the time. When Don was born, few movie theaters existed. But by the time he again turned 10 years of age, the cinema had become enormously popular. Most people actually went to the movies once a week. Stars like Mary Pickford, Rudolph Valentino, Charlie Chaplin, and Lillian Gish were enormously popular. Babe Ruth was making histories, hitting home runs and becoming America's true first sports hero. The 20s was also the time of the flapper. Young women shortened their skirts and bobbed their hair and took to drinking and smoking and putting on makeup and going out with young men without chaperones. The emphasis on getting over the war, which had just ended World War I, and having fun and spending money, generally summarizes why that period of time was known as the Roaring Twenties. However, fun times came to an abrupt end on a Tuesday when Don was 9 years old, and the stock market crashed on October 29, 1929. This led to a period of time in U.S. history referred to as the Great Depression. Don grew up at a point in time when, by conservative estimates, more than 25% of the workforce were unemployed. President Hoover didn't do very much to alleviate the crisis, but in 1932, President Roosevelt promised his New Deal, which created a much more involved role of the federal government in all Americans' lives. Don would later join the federal government and have a stellar public service career, which I will discuss later. In 1933, around the time Don was 12 years old, Prohibition ended, liquor sales began, but Don saw a host of natural disasters in addition to the man-made ones of the Depression. For example, that is, for most of the 1930s, people in the Midwest suffered through what is infamously known as the Dust Bowl, which was the worst drought in American history. During this time, hundreds of severe dust storms were blowing around. It carried away all the soil and made it all but impossible to grow crops. Don's family had already moved to Chicago, having moved there right before he started elementary school, I believe, but they didn't escape the effects of the Dust Bowl. On May 10th, 1934, an estimated 12 million tons of dust blew in from the west and descended on Chicago. That was 18 days before Don's 13th birthday. What was life like for Don as a young man? Much of the world was at war when the 1940s began, all within the confines of a Great Depression that was still affecting the lives of all Americans. But when Pearl Harbor was attacked, the United States could no longer sit on the sidelines, nor could Don. Shortly after Don graduated high school, he went off to war. Through the courage and sacrifice of soldiers such as Don, who served in the Army during World War II in the South Pacific, and other soldiers who fought in the European and Pacific theaters, Don and his contemporaries spent much of this decade in a battle for a way of life that the U.S. and the Western powers had been working to build for more than 2 centuries. On May 7th, 1945, Germany surrendered. On August 16th, 1945, U.S. Harry Truman gave the go-ahead for the U.S. to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. And on August 15th, Japan surrendered, and the war was over for Don and the rest of the world. Don was 24 years old. Now I ask us to reflect back for a moment, starting with when Don was born, to the point when he was only in his early 20s. Think of all the changes, good and bad, joyous and tragic, that he had seen and been part of. No cars on the road to millions of cars on the road. No movie theaters to almost everyone going to the movies almost every week. No radios in homes to almost every home having radio. Major shifts in culture from flappers and jazz, changing politics, such as women recently having gained the vote before he was born and starting to vote. Prohibition and the reinstatement of alcohol, the stock market crash, economic meltdown, the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, shift in majority rural living to majority urban living, and a recently ended World War, only for a second World War to erupt, in which Don served and received a medal for his distinguished service. That's far more than has or will ever happen to most of us in our entire lifetimes. And we still haven't gotten to the 1960s and 70s, when everything else changed for Don and the rest of the country, which I don't have time to get into. As well as meeting and marrying Susie, which I will talk about in a moment. After the war ended, a law was passed known as the GI Bill, offering war veterans such as Don assistance to attend college. Don decided to go to college on the GI Bill, first attending Roosevelt University in Chicago, which was established in 1945 as one of the very first colleges open to all races and jointly enrolling both men and women. After earning his BA, Don went on to earn his master's degree and doctorate at the University of Illinois, Urbana. After earning his doctorate, he began a 35-plus stellar year career at the U.S. Treasury Department. During this time at the Treasury Department, Don rose in the ranks and had a beautiful office overlooking the White House. He was often called to meetings at the White House and various foreign embassies, met with foreign leaders, and he was an active member of the prestigious press club. He traveled much of the world and met and later married his wife Susie on December 11th, 1971 at the Royal Thai Embassy in DC. It was a combination Christian and Buddhist-style ceremony reception and was hosted by the Thai ambassador, and forgive me if I mispronounce his name, Suntorn Hangladara. Throughout their marriage, Don and Susie continued to travel for work and pleasure. Because of Don's exemplary contributions at the Treasury Department and his involvement with numerous charitable and policy-related organizations, he and Susie were invited to every presidential inauguration day event as VIP guests, where they witnessed several presidential inaugurations from their reserved seats by the U.S. Capitol balcony where presidents are sworn in. In closing, Don has been part of this church since 1972. Many, and perhaps most of us who know Don through his involvement with this church or having met Don in other settings and circumstances may not have thought about or been aware of all that Don has seen and accomplished during his lifetime. That's because Don is not like so many today who boast of their lives and accomplishments, real, imagined, or embellished. Being part of the greatest generation, he embodies the attitudes and ethics of that generation. One of quiet strength, humility, perseverance through difficult times, self-sacrifice, accomplishment, and fellowship. My wife Serena and I have had the pleasure of attending for the past dozen or so years Thanksgiving dinners that Don and Susie host each year. Thanksgiving is a time to be thankful for all that we have been blessed to receive and to join in fellowship with others. I know you join me in expressing admiration, respect, and appreciation for Don. He has truly seen it all, the very best to the very worst that this world and humanity have to offer. And as evidenced by his character and life example, he never let the bad overshadow the good. Happy birthday, Don.